of progress.
Hi everybody, I'm Crystal Haynes. Tonight on Greater Boston, yet another crisis on the T, and this time manufacturing failures on well over half of the newly built Green Line extension. How bad is the problem? How did the MBTA fail to fix it before the line opened? And how long will it take to fix? We'll dig into all of that. Plus, a look back at the 15th annual Boston Asian American Film Festival and how you can celebrate Asian films all year long. Plus, the restaurant bringing soul to the seaport, graced by Nia and its owner, just honored by the Boston Business Journal. The problems plaguing the MBTA's Green Line extension are a lot worse than we previously thought. According to officials, the extension's rails are too narrow in about half of Union Square branch, and 80% of the Medford Tufts branch will need to be fixed. Well, it's a whopping failure in construction and communication. Governor Healey's administration is placing blame on their predecessors in the Baker administration, claiming that previous T officials knew about the problems and didn't report them. Officials say the extension is currently still safe for riders, but it'll need to go through extensive repairs, the cost of which MBTA General Manager Philip Ang promises will fall entirely on the original contractors. Well, to break this all down is former Assistant Secretary of Transportation, Chris Dempsey. Thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be with you, Crystal.
So, was this news a surprise to you?
It was a surprise, and it's unfortunate. The analogy here is you went to IKEA, you got the bookcase, and you're starting to put it together, and something just seems a little bit off. You know, the screws aren't quite lining up, but you make it work. You start putting the books on the bookshelf, and you just know that it's not going to hold. That's what happened here with the Green Line. They got it set up. They installed it, they started running trains since last year, but as they've done further testing, they've realized that the tracks are too narrow and have to be fixed.
But it was enormous cost. And also, like, couldn't you figure that out beforehand?
Yeah, and that's what's troubling here is all the way back in 2021, they did some testing on one of the rail yards in Medford that they built as part of this project, and they found that those tracks were too narrow. But instead of using that information and then testing the rest of the line, they kind of kept it isolated to just that yard. Fast forward a year and a half to November of 2022, they want to open it in about a month. They do more testing and they find that in fact the rail is too narrow across the entire extension. There were 29 places that were critical safety issues. They fixed those. But the rest of the line, as you said, 50% of Union Station line and 80% of the Medford Tufts line was too narrow, and they still decided to open up the Green Line extension anyway in December. It's frustrating to those of us that are riders of the Green Line that want a system that works, and now we're going to be faced with more disruption.
Especially when you're talking about these slow zones, and then the connector, the blue line, red line connector that the T and the city and the state want to break ground on.
Yeah, that's another project, and I think it's an important one. But we need to improve our ability to execute on these projects. I think it's fair for the public to have some doubt about the MBTA's ability to really manage and implement the vision that we have for the system. And
that would mean that these slow zones will continue at least until they can figure out exactly what's going to happen next.
Yeah, so I think on the Green Line extension, they are going to bring it back to normal speed. Where the rails are now is they're too narrow to meet a construction standard, but they are okay for basic safety standards. They did bring it down to basically a walking speed for a couple days last week, just to make sure they were being safe. Now that they've gone through some additional testing, it's back. But again, it's going to lead to some disruptions, whether that work happens at night or on the weekends. Riders can expect more delays.
Do you think that this is just one of many things we may see coming down the line? I mean, everyone was so excited when this extension opened and it was running, and then now we're hearing about these problems.
Yeah. I hope that this is the last we're going to hear of major structural issues. I don't think we're really going to know for another couple of years. This, as you said, is a project that is really important, not just to Somerville and Medford, but to the entire region. It's going to take a lot of cars off the road. It's going to provide new transit access to tens of thousands of Massachusetts residents. And it's the first subway line that we've opened in Massachusetts since the late 80s, early 90s. So it's been 30 years. We need to get back to a culture where we're expanding our transit system. We know that we have some of the worst congestion in the country. We have some really bad air pollution from all that traffic. transportation is one of the most frustrating issues, along with housing, for many households. We have to be making investments. We need to do better than what we did with the Green Line extension.
Do you think there's also concern for the businesses that invested in these areas around the new Green Line, and now they're seeing that this might be an issue, for many years to come?
I think that's right. I think, if you're the mayor of Somerville or Medford, you're saying, wait a minute, our communities were starting to orient around these lines, and now we can't do it. I will say this about transportation. Transportation change can be very frustrating. It can take a very long time. On the other hand, when you build something in transportation, it usually lasts for 100 years or more. And so if we have a little bit of a rough start on this Green Line extension, but 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now, it's still working, it will be an investment that we feel will have paid off.
Do we feel like this track issue is just endemic to the new Green Line extension, or should we just check all the tracks just to make sure there aren't any other issues?
That's a good question. So there is a system to check the width of the tracks that the T does use and deploys on all of its rail throughout the system. What we can tell so far from the information that's been shared is that this was really an issue that happened in the factory. So these rail ties arrived from the factory with the plates pre-installed, and they were put down and the rails were put on top of them. It's not actually something the MBTA was doing. It's something that a provider for the contractor for the MBTA was doing. And so it came out of the factory wrong, and now it's being fixed. There's no evidence yet that that factory has produced other rail ties for other parts of the MBTA system. So I don't think riders need to be worried about that at the moment.
How difficult will it be to get the contractors to make good on this? Because, that could be a concern.
Yeah. So far, I think the T has been very clear about wanting the contractors to pay, and we don't know the cost estimate yet. But I would hope and expect that the contractors, the private third-party contractors, will live up to their commitments and live up to their contract and fix this. I think the greater problem here is we don't know what that disruption will be. It's a relatively easy fix in terms of taking the plate out, moving it out a little bit, and putting it back in. But you're doing that on an active rail line, and that's where the complication happens. So you can really only do that when the line is entirely shut down. It is shut down every night for 3 or 4 hours, but that doesn't give you much time to actually fix many of the ties. It will be faster and more effective for the MBTA to shut down the entire line for days or a week. That'll be faster at fixing it, but that'll be really frustrating for the commuters in Somerville and Medford who have planned their lives around this line being open and are now going to be back on shuttle buses instead.
Do you think, in your experience, as the MBTA looks to contract out for more projects, that they'll be maybe taking a second look at the way that they choose contractors to make sure something like this doesn't happen again?
Yeah, look, I think that's really important. What you want at the MBTA is you want a team of leaders and managers who are good at sort of separating the legitimate, strong contractors from the weaker ones, who are good at understanding how to get good value for taxpayer and fair payer dollars. That's the most essential thing in the construction management side of the MBTA. And again, it's obviously a place where the T needs to get better. Now, some of the managers, in fact, most of them who were leading this project inside the MBTA have since moved on to other jobs, other places, other agencies. So we've got a new crop here under General Manager Phil Eng. He seems to be trying to put the right people in place, and I think we have to give him the benefit of the doubt, but there's clearly a lot of work to do.
What do you make of this sort of back and forth where the Healy administration's like, it's not our fault, it's previous administrations? Like, is there a benefit to any of that kind of?
Yeah. I don't think that it does us much good to place blame, especially when most of these people have moved on. I do think it's interesting for the public and for the media to kind of dig in, and the Boston Globe has found some emails that show that this issue was reported to the head of the project. The head of the project, when he talked to Commonwealth Magazine, denied any knowledge of it. So there's a discrepancy there. And that kind of inside baseball is intriguing. At the end of the day, what we need to do is we need to instill a culture at the MBTA of more transparency and more openness, where this stuff is not swept under the rug, it's not hidden. And I do think that the Healy administration understands that. They're not perfect, they're getting better at it, but they are headed in the right direction.
Chris Dempsey, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Crystal.
Next up, movies have the power to reflect our own experiences back at us, as well as introduce us to communities, cultures, and concepts different from our own. Well, that's the mission of the Boston Asian American Film Festival, which just wrapped up its 15th year. Now featuring over a dozen films, documentaries, and short stories, the nationally recognized event highlights many Asian American filmmakers and their stories in Greater Boston and of course beyond. For more information on the festival and how you can celebrate Asian American films all year round, I'm joined by the festival's director and creative producer at Arts Emerson, Susan Chinsen. Susan, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, Crystal. Thank you so much for having me.
So 15 years, it must been a labor of love.
It really has been a passion project of mine, yes.
So talk to me about the process in terms of getting folks to enter, like the judging process. What does that usually look like?
Yeah, I actually take a little bit of pride in that we don't typically do it the way many other festivals do. Our programming screening committee is actually made of what I would consider community people. They're not necessarily particularly film critics or advocates or students of film studies. They're really people from the community who are actually watching these films and rating them, judging them as sort of how they actually connect to them.
Do you find that each year there ends up being sort of a unifying theme or a theme that jumps out, or is it really just all over the place because it's different experiences?
I mean, in the past, we'd like to think that we've come up with a theme, and we've had themes over the past years, and we still continue to use one. I think one that we have always leaned towards is Rising Together, and that certainly has been one that has come up again this year. But in particular, I think the vast diversity of the stories that actually come in through us, it's very hard to pinpoint necessarily just one. We did have one theme probably more about surrounding elders this year than we typically do, so that was actually kind of nice too.
What were some of the standout films that were submitted?
Oh goodness, I feel like I can't really pick too many, but I do have to say I think within our documentary films there were two in particular that really stood out. One called Nurse Unseen, talking about Filipino nurses and sort of where that history came from and why, sort of what their experience during COVID had been. And another sort of a biographical one on a photographer named Corky Lee out of New York, who is sort of the I'm trying to think of the exact name, but like the photographer laureate, undisputed of Asian American, Asian America, essentially. It's just, he was a photographer that was captured film experiences from, Vincent Chin to community celebrations all across, the diversity of Asian Americans, but had passed away during COVID.
Yeah, so when we're talking about representation in the film industry, we know that minorities, struggle to have the same sort of success as other groups. So this is really an opportunity to tell stories, create a platform for telling Asian American stories.
Yes, I think within Boston, I grew up here in the Greater Boston area, and in that time period, there was lots of places that would feature Asian cinema or stories about Asia, and it was very difficult to actually find stories that actually felt like I could connect to. And that had been a big, mission of mine in terms of wanting to have more space for that here in Boston. So hence the film festival was created. We've been able to really do that in terms of uplifting different neighborhoods and community organizations that we continue to partner with to actually feature these stories. So that's been a huge, direction of us really wanting to move towards.
Yeah, and you brought us some special, materials here talking about, movies by and also involving Asian American folks.
Yes, so a big part, this year, with it being our 15th anniversary, we actually had two sort of big bookend events for ourselves. Our opening night event, I'll actually just share, was with Jeff Yang, who is a sort of observer, commentator, expert on sort of Asian American culture across America. And he actually just is publishing a book. It's actually coming out officially tomorrow, October 24th. Tomorrow, October 24th, called The Golden Screen. And we actually were privileged to have him and filmmaker Renee Tajima Pena here with us. She was the series producer for Asian Americans, which aired here on PBS locally. But he is publishing this book. If I can show you,
of course.
This is the book. And
beautiful artwork.
It is amazing for those of audiences who may have seen Everything Everywhere All at Once. It's sort of thematically based on that. But there's a lot of different elements within the art that talks about, references what's inside of the book itself. I'll just note that this is a book that could not have come out 15 years earlier. This really, I felt, symbolized a lot of the work that the film festival itself has done. Many of the films that we have actually shown historically are included in this book. It's an anthology.
That's incredible.
Of all sort of, a variety of films that sort of have really, it's called The Golden Screen, The Movies That Made Asian America. And for me, I feel like that really represents a lot of, for myself, how I connected, I think, for a lot of the volunteers and staff that work on the film festival have been able to find home here in Boston. I think Boston, actually, I feel like is a difficult city necessarily to find your people in your community. I know that a lot of the volunteers, a lot of our audience members continuously come every year because of the community that they find. Being able to come together, I know it was very difficult during COVID. We found a way to get through it through virtual programming, but kind of on this side of COVID, we're all really happy to still have that with us today. So. Yeah, I could continue going on about
this.
I
love it. And, I think also, it also breaks the stereotypes, because as you mentioned, when you think of Asian American cinema, I mean, let's be honest, we think of kung fu movies and that kind of thing. But that doesn't reflect the rich culture and the diaspora of Asians and in the world, but also in the United States.
No, certainly. And I think there's also, the stereotype of model minorities and sort of what a lived experience of a person who looks like myself, the question of where do you come from, is something that many people who look like myself are often faced with. And I think these films are ones in which people from, who have that represent a variety of the lived experiences are able to actually share. I think similar to Nurse Unseen, I feel like coming out of COVID, that really just touched so many people in the audience, myself included, about thinking how has American history intersected with other countries overseas that have actually really impacted large swaths of people, and even the healthcare system that we are all benefiting from here. And they're not talked about, it's not discussed, it's not a visible group of people. And in many ways, this is something that is it's long overdue for them to have a spotlight, to be able to hear from them and hear their stories about why it is this way.
And there's so many creatives also involved in the festival. There are folks who are doing artwork. There are folks who are organizing different pieces of that as well.
Yeah, I thank you for that question. I actually wanted to share a little bit too. We actually invited a local artist, Bren Bataclan, to join us this year to feature his artwork. He is a queer Filipino artist who often works in the school systems, but he was generous enough to work with us and create a piece of artwork that really represents, I think, sort of the joy that we're all looking for, and the opportunity of how we gather to really represent sort of our 15th anniversary of being together. And so I just wanted to share a piece of work that he had designed for us.
I love that. Yeah. And if folks who weren't able to make it out to the film festival, can they still, get a link or stream some of the films?
Well, unfortunately, we've actually wrapped as of yesterday, but I think if folks want to actually go out and pick up a copy of The Golden Screen, it's actually a wonderful way. I feel like you could actually go through the book itself and go through various streaming services that people have access to and figuring out which ones to go to. I would recommend any of the films in this book, and especially with the commentary that is included. There's beautiful artwork and messages from filmmakers, including John Chu and Daniel Kwan, also locally, from Emerson College. We have, I would highly recommend people picking up the book to kind of find stuff until we come back in the spring.
There you go. All right, we'll be waiting for that. All right, Susan Chinsen, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Crystal.
And finally tonight, Nia Grace means business. And it's not just me saying that. It is also the Boston Business Journal, who named the restaurateur behind Daryl's Corner Bar and Kitchen in the South End, of course, and the new Seaport restaurant, Grace by Nia, one of 5 women who mean business in Boston. We know that's right. The recognition comes a few months after the grand opening of Grace by Nia, a speakeasy lounge with live music and a Creole-style menu, which also made Nia the first Black woman in Boston to own a supper club with a liquor license. Nia Grace joins me now, and I just have to say, you own the hottest joint in town, because I can't tell you how many events I see pop up, and they're like, oh, we're doing it over at Nia's place. That's amazing.
Oh, thank you, Crystal, and thanks for having me.
Of course. So what does that feel like to have this concept of the supper club, right? and then have it be such a smash.
Yeah, I mean, you always hope that the dream that you have for a business is one going to definitely fill a need or a void or something that the audience wants. But then to actually see it and overwhelmingly respond to it, I can't believe it. You know, we thought that we were going to definitely attract some of our old customers from Daryl's. We knew that we might get some visitors because of the neighborhood that we're in. We were hoping that we would get some locals, some of our actual neighbors in the Seaport. But to see it packed on end for the first 6 months, you couldn't get a reservation for 30 days, right? And I think that that's exciting, and I hope it's a tale of, what's to come.
Tell me about the concept and what led you to wanting to create this unique space.
Well, it's been years, right? I've been in the restaurant industry for over 20 years. I used to work at a dinner cruise and musical kind of space called the Spirit of Boston, back when the servers were still kind of performing with the
yeah, I
sing-off.
remember that, yeah.
That was me, one of those servers. And I've always loved the fusion of entertainment and dining. I've always loved and valued my holiday dinners and my Sunday dinners with family and getting around the table and sharing stories and just different moments. We used to watch the kids, kind of dance after dinner was over, and we're watching them, and it's a form of entertainment. And so I say all of that because it's really, it fueled my desire to own that kind of space. Much like my first establishment, I walk in and it smells familiar, it looks familiar, the music is there, and there's a little bit of dancing. And then when it came to Grace by Nia, we wanted to take it to the next level. We were coming out of a 3-year period of a very trying time for the world. And I wanted to get back a renaissance of sort to that time where you could take it slow and let your night gradually, build in volume. And so come in for that cocktail, sit down for dinner, enjoy a show. And then when you're on to dessert in the finale cocktail, maybe you're doing a little bit of dancing with it. So my inspiration has been kind of my experiences throughout the year, but places that I've seen and just nostalgia. So like a Cotton Club or a Copacabana, things that you used to do in Old Vegas. And I wanted to bring that to now because I felt like we needed those moments.
Yeah, and certainly you've also revamped Daryl's, which has been in Boston for decades,
Yes.
right? So
Yeah.
and what is it like taking on something like Daryl's, where people know it to be one thing, but you want to modernize it so it continues to live through generations?
It's a delicate dance, right?
Sure.
And so it's the crossroads of making sure that loyalists like my parents, who are in their 70s and 80s, that they still remember what it was, and then attracting the new generation of college students that are moving in the area so that they can find out what it is, and then being able to say, I think both of these worlds can live in the same space. And so when I say it's a delicate dance, it definitely is, but it's one that I have treasured. It's also one that I feel could only be done by a few people who really get it, who really get keeping a legacy and making sure that all the people involved with it still have that buying power, including the future.
You were named one of these women who mean business. You don't see a lot of us in the Seaport operating really successful businesses. What does it mean to you to be in that space at sort of the top of your game, not sort of the top of your game,
yeah.
and knowing that it takes a lot to get to where you are?
Yeah, I would say that I'm still on that incline, and I can appreciate the fact that, I'm going in that direction. But what it means to me is that, women like my grandmother, who I watched and who I admired, we're no longer just relegated to being the secretary, the support, right? It means that we can lead and we are valued, and, our opinion as well as our thoughts and our creativity are more than just things that should be put on paper or kept in our head. For me, it's also a matter of being fearless. And I feel like, women often, or at least from my own personal experience, we second guess ourselves. And oftentimes we just have to do. And I think that Grace by Nia for sure is one of those moments where I spent 2 to 3 years second guessing myself. We worked on this project for over 2 years, but we were thinking about it beforehand. And I finally just was like, well, it's just time to do it. And so it feels great to just do it and walk in the space and be a role model for so many, for the people that I actually work with on a daily basis, and for people who just see me on the street and say that I'm so inspired by your story. A couple of years ago, I was recognized as maybe one of the most influential people in Boston, and that was great, an honor I probably would have never thought was going to happen. But what it meant for me was so more is that someone is now going to look at me and realize it's possible. And so that's what this means to me, is that it's possible.
What was your biggest challenge, in opening? Like you said, we were just coming out of the pandemic where restaurants weren't doing as well.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge was thinking that this is something that is right? We had no market data that could show us what happens when you get out of a 3-year pandemic, or at least get to the tail end of a 3-year pandemic, and wonder, is it a good time to start a new business? What we could see is that some people were able to pivot during that time. Restaurants were hit the hardest. We can talk about that stat often. We can talk about how it is one of the hardest industries to even survive the first 18 months, let alone 5 years. And then again, is this the right time to do it when things are higher in terms of costs of goods? Here in Boston, with our liquor license, policies and procedures, and just the cost of that, that's another hurdle. It's just like all these things are stacking up. Is this the right time to do it? And there are some people who are fearless and who are able to do it and jump out there and say, listen, I guess if it fails, then that's what it does. But the hardest thing was to essentially make sure that I no longer was a person who was going to be fearful of taking a chance,
I'm also thoughtful of, you said you were trying to create an atmosphere where you could go and it feels like a family style atmosphere. I was at an event at Daryl's one time, and my son was like on the drums in there. And I have so many girlfriends that have been in Grace by Nia and have been like, I feel like I belong here, where I may not feel like I belong in that space, in other places in the Seaport, rather. What does it mean to have created that atmosphere and make people feel belonged?
Yeah, I think for me, I always say it starts at the top. And so my partners, Ed Kane, Randy Greenstein, with Big Night Entertainment Group, we get it, right? And we get it collectively. And so when you get it at the top, it starts to trickle down. And so for our hiring practices, the kind of people that we're looking for, the folks that are going to make it, that's where it starts. So it definitely starts with the people. And if we come in with the right intention where we can serve you, absolutely. And that might be some of the feeling that you get where it's just like, this is just an exchange, this is a transaction. But what we specialize in is hospitality, and hospitality on its highest level, where every time you walk in, we want to make it feel like if this is your first time, we know for sure this isn't going to be your last time, but we also want you to walk in and feel like you've been here before, and like you get this really great hug when you walk in. And I think that a part of it and what makes it successful and it makes it something that is received by so many people is because there are two things that are very common about what we do. We're providing a really good comfort meal, right? We're doing that in a way that is presented well in a very nice environment, but it's familiar, even if there's some innovation to it. And then there's music. And at the end of the day, when I look around that room and I see a 21-year-old and a 75-year-old bopping their head to the exact same beat, that is a unifier. And so I think that when you walk in, we took the basics of our business and made those the elements that we knew could unify people. And then we just kind of wrapped it up with the people who actually make it happen every day.
All right. Well, you certainly are making it happen. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Crystal. I appreciate it.
Well, that's it for tonight, but we'll be right back here tomorrow. I'm Crystal Haynes. Thank you for watching. Good night.